HVAC just went off, so you can be heard. Sorry to our speakers that didn't happen sooner. If you have cards that you would like to raise up and have Roseanne read, you can do that. Or if you would like to just raise your hand and ask questions. When you ask your question, please indicate whether you would like one candidate or both candidates to answer it. And it looks like Roger would like to go first.
Well, this is for both candidates, as I hope all the questions are, and that is, Washington is infamous in this country for having the single most regressive tax system of all the states. Every time we want to do something good like fund transit, we have to ding the lowest economic sectors, the sales taxes and car tax. It's a horrible system. The voters reject an income tax every time it's been proposed. Do either of you have any ideas that might be effective? I don't want to hear rhetoric about how we got to work out there and work real hard to get an income tax. It ain't going to happen. What are the things that could happen?
So can we go the same order since Louis won the coin toss? Is that okay?
Sure, that's fine.
Well, that's a very good question because even though Bill Gates Sr. had really great arguments for an income tax, it didn't happen. So the first thing is that I've been focused on really the issues that are before us because, of course, in the last few months we've had gun violence. And so personally, I think that it's all about jobs and economic development because when you have, and it's easier to actually get a gun than it is to get a job, that's a real problem. And so that's where I started to look and say, well, first of all, let's look at the taxes. So the small business owners, basically the tax system with the business and occupation tax is on the backs of small business owners, okay? And because large businesses, of course, have lots of tax preferences. And so the first thing is I said, well, look, we need to go ahead and we need to give some relief to small business owners, be able to encourage them, because right now they're paying based on gross income rather than on net income. So, if you don't have any profits, you still have to pay a lot of tax, a substantial amount of tax. And so that's a real problem. So I said that first of all, let's go ahead and change that system. And one of the things that advantages of that is that actually it's the beginning of a corporate income tax. And I think that what the public needs to feel is they need to feel trust in our government. Trust that, if we impose a income tax, that we're not going to just keep the rest of the tax system the way it is, okay? And so I think that that's one of the ways we can do that is to, first of all, work with this obviously a good step, first step, into meeting this goal.
Well, I totally agree with you. I wrote an op-ed that's in The Stranger that you can find online about our structural problems in the state around our tax system. And it's specifically that 60% of all of our income, all of our revenue in the state comes from sales and excise taxes. So as that base shrinks, right, because we're no longer a goods-based economy, we're a services-based economy, services aren't taxed, goods are really, sales tax is really regressive. So we rightly have excluded things like food from that. So it's really, we're taxing this base of about a third of all of the goods that are out there. And it's shrinking. So at the same time that our economy is growing, our tax revenue base is shrinking. And we have put all of our eggs into that sales tax bucket. What we need to do is diversify our sources of revenue. And ideally, we go towards an income tax. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But at a minimum, we can start taxing things that are about growing wealth. So, for example, we can do a capital gains tax. We can do an increased estate tax. There are other ways that we can tax income growth so that it doesn't actually leave us aside. We also have a limit, because of IMAN, on our property tax increases. If we are going to increase property taxes, which a lot of people are talking about out there, I believe we need to have something like a striker clause, which basically says you can't pay more than a certain amount of your income in property taxes. Because I don't want to see people still priced out of property here in the 37th, which I've seen a lot happening. And then we have to look at exemptions and loopholes. There are over 150 tax exemptions that have been on the books for decades. Nobody has ever looked at them. They just continue because there's a powerful powerful lobby pushing for them or because nobody's actually looked at them. But there's money to be had by saying, what are the exemptions that really need to happen? What really creates jobs here? And how do we close loopholes so that we can make that happen? I did want to say something about the income tax though. 2 years ago, I would not have believed we could pass $15 in Seattle. I really wouldn't. If somebody had told me that, I would have said you're dreaming. And I believe our job as activists is to push the limits of what's possible, and I believe that that's true as policymakers as well. That we have got to start explaining what is structurally wrong, not by asking people to pay more taxes, but by asking people what they want to invest in. It's like membership in a club. You belong to this community, you pay a certain membership, and you get something back. And income taxes, Oregon is in the same position, but flipped, right? So they have all of their eggs in the income tax basket and nothing else. So we have got to work on that and build a campaign that creates the public will over the next 2 to 3 to 4 years to actually get an income tax passed. And we don't have any better opportunity to start that work than now with McCleary, with the McCleary decision from the Supreme Court.
Let's see, Myra and then
Ramen.
Raman. So Myra and then Raman, please.
So assuming you get, this is for both candidates, assuming you get elected and you go down to Olympia and you're, you're in a Republican majority or very close situation, what are the specific things of how would you go about getting some of this passed? What are the specific things that you would do to make sure that some of this happens? And I'm realistic. I'm sure not everything will get through, but there's what kind of coalitions do you see on the other side that can be leveraged to be able to get some of this passed?
Flip.
So my whole life has been as a coalition builder, and so I've already started thinking about what that looks like in the state Senate if we don't have the majority. And first of all, we are working very hard to try to win the majority, and for people that want to go door knock with us in Matt Eisenhower's district, we are doing that this weekend, and we've gone to Sherry Song's district. But let's say we don't have the majority. I believe that part of how you do that is by finding common ground and building relationships with people where you don't have to agree on 100% of things. I mean, my spouse and I don't even agree on 100% of things, but he's going to vote for me. And so, the question is, how do we find those places where we can come to common agreement? And I've done this on immigration reform. We worked with the sheriff of Yakima County. We worked with, folks, agricultural groups in Eastern Washington. In the state Senate, we worked with John McCain and Lindsey Graham and others to pass the Senate immigration bill, even though we don't agree on a whole bunch of other stuff. So I've already started having conversations with potential future colleagues on the Republican side as well as the Democratic side, because that is, I think, where we look at where do our values align, and how can we get out of these specific boxes that we're in. There are specific things that I know already and have identified already as places where people want to collaborate. So education, actually, there's Joe Fain, who's a Republican in just south of our district, has a big immigrant community and a big community of color in his district, right? So can we find a place there where we can actually come together and talk about the things that we want to move together? We've been able to pass the State Dream Act, which I started working on when I was still at One America, and thanks to many people probably in this room and outside, we were able to get that passed in a bipartisan way. We passed a TBIP, a Transitional Bilingual Instruction Program extension for ELL kids in particular in the state Senate with the majority caucus in power. So a lot of it is not like specific, I can't tell you specifically, I'm going to do, we're going to work on this, but it's like, how do you find those places where we can say, you know what, we're human beings, we both want the same things for our communities, how do we move forward on that and put aside partisan politics? And I think I've got a record of doing that.
Well, one of the things I think that's really important when you look at this issue about working with everybody in the legislature is that it's, this is all about being about people, when I represent you in the legislature, it's about you. And so when I deal with the legislature, the first thing is, first of all, is, people have all kinds of different labels about me. So they say, well, I'm an engineer, and they have certain ideas about that. If I say I'm a business professor, they have other ideas. But it really blows their mind when I say that my wife and I used to teach ballroom dancing, we used to teach foxtrot and swing. Or the fact that I actually sing. People are kind of surprised by that. So the first thing is that you have to deal with people at a people level, right? We're not talking about policy. We're not talking about, the next legislative agenda. We're talking about people. And, the relationship is, and trust is a very important part of that. And so, and I can honestly say that no matter where I live, that people by and large say they like me. That's a big plus. So, and the other thing, but I think the other thing that you have to consider is that about independence. Okay, I said that the most important thing is I represent you, and what I'm really proud about my endorsements is that there are people from the community, individual endorsements, people like Council Member Bruce Harrell. People like Al Sugiyama, who's just lives just down the block here. His experience talking about the Seattle School Board, or former State Representative Velma Valaria. Those are people that have been really great advisors, and of course, many of you have advised me on things. So I consider that to be very important because I believe that I'm going to be very independent about making decisions and being able to do the right thing and not being beholden to special interests.
So it's Ron, right?
Ramen, like the
Ramen.
noodles.
Ron, Ted, and Pat. So Ron, Ted, and Pat.
And we have a total of 7 minutes.
Okay, so we'll just start with Ron and then we'll see what happens.
It's just a quick question. How do you plan on addressing the problem of affordable housing in this district?
So maybe each of you can just take a minute to respond so we can get everybody's question.
Okay.
Yes, affordable housing. When I was working with Rory Sullivan on this issue, one of the things that we have, of course, right now is the question about apartments. And of course, there's been some decisions that have been made in that area. But, I think for certain types of needs, that's fine, but that's certainly not everything. Because what we see is that everything is going up. So the first thing is that we need to be able to address it by, first of all, creating the wealth that we need so that everybody can stay on top of it, right? We don't have that many jobs here. We don't have that much revenue being generated here in the way that some other areas have. And so that's the lack of investment, and that's the lack of jobs in this area. So affordability, is dependent very much on our ability for everybody to be have an equitable stake in the economic system.
I'm really excited to be working with the Affordable Housing Coalition, and we are already thinking about how do we recapitalize the Housing Trust Fund, which is one of the top ways in which the state has actually been able to invest in affordable housing. And so El Centro de la Raza, I know we'll turn around here, El Centro de la Raza, up here, and their new affordable housing complex that they're going to be building, which is funded in part by the state. Estella, as an individual, has endorsed me. She's been a friend for a long time. Very excited about the opportunity to provide different kinds of investments for affordable housing. We also need to tackle the issue of rents only in this way. Most of it is a city issue. But the state does have the authority to lift the prohibition on rent control. And if we lift the prohibition on rent control, it allows the city of Seattle to enact rent control if the people of the city of Seattle demand it. So there are a few things that we can look at even there. And I'm just, Interim, which is another housing developer, nonprofit housing developer, has actually developed the most capacity for affordable housing around, of any developer in the city of Seattle, has been funded a lot by the Housing Trust Fund and the state dollars that have gone into providing affordable housing. So looking for opportunities to build that and to continue to bring developers into that so that we create a robust form of subsidizing housing so that we can actually make it affordable for people to live here.
Ted and then Pat. I think that'll take us to see what happens.
Okay. When I first remember paying sales tax, the rate was 1/2 of 1 cent per dollar. Now it's about 10%. If we switch over from our regressive system to an income tax system, what steps are both of you going to take to protect the public against tax bracket creep?
Yeah. This is one of the biggest questions that people have. They don't trust that the government, if given the authority to have an income tax, would actually limit sales tax. But you can write that into law. And you can make it, such that it would have to be overturned by a majority of the people if it were ever going to be overturned. There's ways to assure people that we would reduce sales tax. The whole point of bringing an income tax in, and particularly a progressive income tax, is to take away, I call it, because regressive is the word that everyone uses, but I think it's just upside down economics, right? You have the bottom 20% of people in terms of income paying about 17% of their income in taxes. The top 20% pays about 2.7% of their income in taxes. It's absolutely upside down. And so if we can get an income tax in, and it can be a progressive income tax, you would reduce sales tax, of course, because you're trying to get the regression out of it. And you then would also introduce other pieces, whether it's tax exemptions or...
Tax bracket creep, you didn't address that.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what you mean by tax bracket creep, because if you're reducing the sales tax and you are...
If it's initially set at 10% for a certain income, what's going to stop the legislature next year from bumping it up to 15% for that set segment?
I mean, anything is possible to write into a piece of legislation.
So what would you
and
do
make
with
it?
that?
Well, if we got to an income tax, we need to look at what the revenue is there, and we could write in. I mean, I'm really happy to, if we can just have the conversation about what's structurally wrong, and then propose a tax, we can work with the other issues of tax bracket creep, of how do you actually protect people to not have their taxes go above a certain amount, right? But you've got to get to that conversation, which in this state, it's income tax is a third rail of all politics. Nobody wants to talk about it. We've got to say it's time for us to talk about it because we need our kids to go to good schools. We need healthcare. We need roads. And that's how I would approach it.
Thank you.
Well, this issue about bracket creep is a real problem, and not only do we have this concern about creep in the sales tax, but we also have the concern about creep in property tax. I mean, I hear so many people when I doorbell talking about that and saying that, I'm on a fixed income, and if it keeps going up, I'm going to have to move. That's a real issue. And one of the aspects, of course, is as property values go up, your taxes go up too, right? So that's a real problem for people. And so first of all, one way to try to deal with it, to sort of try to level that, is to talk about, say, cost of living, right? For me to be able to stay in a house and I've invested, my life to have this house, and I want to be able to live in it and until I die, right? I love this house, maybe, and I see so many people that talk about that. So I think it's very important to talk about the fact that we need to be able to talk about the fact that there's a cost of living, right? And that just because prices go up doesn't necessarily mean that my means has changed, right? So I think it's very important. Something like that, we can write something like that as one possible solution. And I'm not saying that that's the only solution. The other aspect I think that really helps is to talk about, say, the basket of taxes. So one of the things I'm also supporting is the carbon neutral, the revenue neutral carbon tax. Because I think that number one, we do have to deal with our environment and carbon emissions. And so that's, I think, a strategy that seems